Hello history buffs and welcome back to my channel. My name is Chloe Eastwood and I've been teaching for the last 2 months and that has taken it out of me a little bit more than I thought it would. But I'm back. I have new content planned. Now, before I started teaching, I had some really high energy, high effort, high concept videos that I was working on, planning, writing, and my goodness, the editing. But I just don't have time for that right now. So this video and the next couple are going to be not low effort, but smaller, just smaller project, little bites. Hopefully you still enjoy them. Hopefully you still find them interesting. This video is going to be about Hammurabi's Code, and specifically, how do you read a historical document to really get the most out of reading what scraps and traces we have from history. What can we tell about this society based on, honestly, not that much text. By way of introduction, let's discuss what Hammurabi's Code was. Hammurabi's Code is the first legal document that we have. It was written almost 4,000 years ago by the king of Babylon. And if you remember anything about it, you're going to remember that this code of law has basically never heard of the idea of reforming a criminal after they do a crime. It's all preventative in terms of there are going to be some really hard punishments if you do a crime, and it's retributive in that most of the punishments are incredibly harsh, and they include, but certainly are not limited to, getting thrown in the river and presumably drowning, getting burned on a fire, having your hands cut off, having other body parts cut off, getting your family sold into slavery, getting yourself sold into slavery. But while this code is very jarring and honestly could probably make good content in and of itself, in fact, my first attempt at making this video was just a line-by-line reaction video to the code, I think that we can dig a little deeper and do something more interesting as historians. Part 1, the introduction. Hammurabi's Code has an introduction to it where he essentially breaks down, here is why I have the authority in order to make the laws, and it's a whole bunch about how he's related to the different gods and how he has his divine authority. And then he breaks down all the reasons why he needs to write a code of law. And this is honestly a great idea. If you've never seen a code of law before, you might wonder, why do we all have to follow these rules now? We didn't have to follow them before. But if you give people your vision and mission statement, say, here's why things are going to be better if we have this code of law, and also, even if you don't like those things, here's why I have the authority to do it, your code's gonna fly a little better. And his introduction reads like this. Then Anu and Bel called by name me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince who feared God, to bring about the rule of righteousness to the land, to destroy the wicked and evildoers, so that strong should not harm the weak, and that I should rule over the black-headed people like Shamash, and enlighten the land, to further the well-being of mankind. Now, we Americans have something like this, and in fact I think most societies have something like this, but in America we have the preamble to our Constitution, which reads, actually I've got a Constitution, hold on, let me get my Constitution. I know it off the top of my head, but I just want to show off that I do in fact have a Constitution. Okay, here we go. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and ensure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So we've got a breakdown of who's writing it and why. We've got a code of law coming. Why are we writing it? But the thing is, in different times and different places, you'll have a different sense of authority. In America, authority comes from we the people, but in ancient Babylon, authority came from the gods. So looking at this, we see where his authority comes from, and we see all the high-minded things that he wants his code to do. This is going to allow us to engage with the code in good faith. We might be tempted to engage with it asking questions like, is this really justice, or does this pass the vibe check? But perhaps a more historically relevant question would be, does this uphold or does this not uphold Hammurabi's own stated purpose in writing these laws? Arguably, this is the most important standard by which to evaluate a piece of history. Now this brings us to part 2, incentives. We've already explored Hammurabi's incentives in writing the code of law, but what does this code of law incentivize in the people over whom he rules? We've already been over the fact that this code is famously draconian, but I think that it would be a trap to get caught in some of the more shocking laws and punishments. See, if we think about Hammurabi's code as something that's harsh and draconian and nothing else, then we might think of it as a blunt instrument. And it wasn't. Not only does Hammurabi's code say some very important things, but it's also very considered in what it might lead somebody to do or want to do. And it takes a lot of preventative measures in order to keep people from abusing the system or abusing the laws in other ways. And there are examples of this throughout the legal code, but we may as well start with law number 1. The first 5 laws are all about how the legal system is going to work. If anyone ensnare another, putting a ban on him, and cannot prove it, then he that ensnared him shall be put to death. So remember, this was a pre-legal society. They did not have laws before these laws were written. People are not used to being able to trust the government to go and do the retribution justice for them. They're used to having to roll up their sleeves, get their pike, I guess, and go track down the person that wronged them and get their justice themselves. Courts and laws are very new social technology for them, and people might be tempted to be slow to adopt that technology. This first law says you are not allowed to do that. You aren't allowed to go hunt people down on a grudge, you're not allowed to go make assumptions, and you can't go make citizens' arrests for no reason. You actually have to follow the laws now. If anyone bring an accusation against a man, and the accused go to the river and leap into the river, if he sink in the river, his accuser shall take possession of his house. But if the river prove that the accused is not guilty, and he escape unhurt, then he who had brought the accusation shall be put to death, while he who leaped into the river shall take possession of the house that had belonged to his accuser. For this law to seem fair, you have to remember that these were deeply religious people. I mean, this code of law is ordained by God giving the right to rule to Hammurabi. These people believe in God. So, a bit like our trial by combat that we see in the past and in fantasy fiction, if you are in the right, the gods will help you out of the river. And if you're wrong, they're going to drown you. It might seem like it's not righteous to us. That doesn't matter. It matters within the context that this was written. Either way, it really incentivizes people not to go make accusations willy-nilly, because if you make an accusation, someone's going to die, and it might be you. It also protects the court's time against frivolous lawsuits, because if you've got somebody who's bickering with a friend over something that's relatively petty, and someone's going to die, either you die or your friend dies, well, which is it? Is it worth dying over, or are we going to bury this hatchet? If anyone bring an accusation of a crime before the elders, and does not prove what he has charged, he shall, if it be a capital offense charged, be put to death. And this is more protection against frivolous suits, which is a problem that has plagued us until today. Number 5, if a judge try a case, reach a decision, and present his judgment in writing, if later error shall appear in his decision, and it be through his own fault, then he shall pay 12 times the fine set by him in the case, and he shall be publicly removed from the judge's bench, and never again shall he sit there to render judgment. So this time we've got incentives and protections, but not for the accuser and the accused. Follow the law, don't accuse people willy-nilly. This time is protection for the people using the justice system by saying the judge actually has to do his job properly, and if he doesn't, then he has to pay a bunch of money and not be a judge anymore. So saying you can't phone it in, this is high stakes, this is big business, do your job properly. And these 4 laws set up something that we're going to see again and again if we read through the entire code, and that is the formatting. Once you really get into the code, you realize that it's repetitive and very granular. In fact, many of these laws seem like they're really just nuances on a previous law or a subsection to a previous law, only because nobody had ever written a legal code before, they just wrote it as a separate law. What these laws, putting wording on wording on wording, is all the places that it was really important for Hammurabi to get things right. And one of my personal favorites are the incest laws. There are 3 laws in particular which are slight variations on each other, and while I certainly can't prove that this happened, I also can't imagine that these laws came around any other way than this happening. In this new code, be it legal for a man to have incest with his daughter? No, absolutely not. Any man who have incest with his daughter be guilty of incest with his daughter. As your majesty wishes, and what shall be the punishment? If a man be guilty of incest with his daughter, he shall be driven from the place, exiled. Okay, but what if a man betroth a girl to his son, and he have intercourse with her, and then afterward the man defile her? Be that legal? Again, no. Afterward, defile her, and what shall be the consequence? Then he shall be bound and cast into the water. Ew, that seems a little harsh. Excuse me? Nothing. Just one more question. I promise this is important. If a man betroth a girl to his son, and the son does not know her, and then he defile her, do I need to begin an investigation? So obviously I can't prove that there was someone quite this creepy in court that day, but the fact that the laws are written this way does show that this was a problem in ancient Babylon. Now, as we've already seen in a couple of case studies I've pulled, the wording can be a little bit weird. Hammurabi's code is written in a dead language, which means that anybody working with the text today is probably working with a translation of that text in a modern language. The version that I'm using, which is from the Avalon Project, is a very literal version of this translation. And I know this because of how strangely the words are used at times. I'd say the strangest of these are probably the way that people are grouped together in interesting ways that we wouldn't necessarily group people today. For example, unmarriageable daughters refers both to priestesses and to prostitutes, because although these two jobs are very different from each other, and I'm sure even back then they thought of them as very different from each other, they have one very important similarity when it comes to family law, inheritance, etc. A lot of Hammurabi's code has to do with things like family law, inheritance, and other such things. And from that point of view, whether or not a daughter is marriageable is actually a lot more important than something like how well regarded her job happens to be. And there's a similar clustering with all the different kinds of people who might be called father. From what I gather, there are 3 kinds of people who might be referred to as father in Hammurabi's code. The first use of the word father is to be your literal daddy. Head of the household, he is your dad. The second is if he is your master and you're an apprentice. And the third is if he is the owner and you are the slave. So why would they use one word for all these different things instead of 3? And there is a meaningful distinction. I can tell based on how the laws are written that these are different relationships even if they use the same word. So why would they use the same word? Now, I don't speak ancient Babylonian, but I'm going to put forth the idea that they use the same word because the social roles, head of the household, the authority in the family, is similar enough in these 3 cases where it's legally expedient to just use that one word instead of to divide it into 3 different if-then scenarios. In conclusion, Hammurabi's code is an absolute treasure trove of ways to read and think about historical documents. And while right now I'm working with my 7th graders to learn about what justice is from Hammurabi's code, there's a lot that you can learn at higher levels too. Over the last couple of years, I've heard a lot of people complain one of 2 things about their history classes. For anybody who likes to complain, we didn't learn this in history, where was this in the curriculum? It's probably because your little kid brains just couldn't soak up that kind of abstract information at the time. And then for anybody who likes to complain, we learned the same thing every single year. Well, it's because your 10-year-old brain couldn't soak up the things that your 14-year-old brain could, and your 14-year-old brain couldn't soak up the same things that your 18-year-old brain could. So they had to keep reintroducing ideas to you so that you could get more and more abstract as time went on and as your brain developed. Learning history is a process of learning facts and skills, sure, but it's also a process of learning to think critically, which sure does take practice, but it also just takes time. You have to let your brain develop. So an astute reader with a fully developed brain can get more out of these documents or other historical documents and get more out of them than they did when they first read them, especially if they first read them in school. I've barely scratched the surface with these, and I'm sure that there are more historical ideas that I didn't even touch on in this video. And further, these tactics that I use for reading historical documents can also be used for close reading other texts. And if you get good at it, it can be a real analytic superpower. All right, I feel good about that. Back in the game. Thank you all for watching to the end. I'd like to thank my amazing patrons for their support of my channel. If you enjoy this content, you can subscribe and like down below, or even donate to my Ko-fi page to help these videos get made. And until next time, make history.